The text message arrived at exactly 6:17 a.m. I remember because I was pouring coffee when my phone vibrated across the kitchen counter. The sender was my cousin, Melissa. The message contained only 7 words. The estate meeting is family only. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, if your own family locked you out of an inheritance meeting, would you walk away or demand answers? I stared at the screen, read it again, then a third time. At first I thought she was joking. She had to be, because the estate meeting she was referring to concerned my grandfather's estate, and if there was one person who should have been there, it was me. I called immediately, straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. A third time. Blocked. I slowly lowered the phone. My stomach felt strange. Not angry. Not yet. Just confused. Because nothing about this made sense. 3 weeks earlier, we'd buried my grandfather, Henry Lawson. The man who had practically raised me. The man whose workshop I spent every summer in. The man who taught me how to repair engines before I learned algebra. The man who showed up to every important moment of my life. When my parents divorced. When I graduated. When I started my first business. When I lost my first business. Grandpa was always there. And during the final 4 years of his life, when his health began failing, I was there too. Every week, every appointment, every emergency, every hospital visit, every birthday, every holiday. I never kept score. Because family isn't supposed to be scorekeeping. At least that's what I believed. Apparently my relatives disagreed. I opened the message again. The estate meeting is family only. The words became more insulting every time I read them. Family only. As if I wasn't family. As if I'd somehow become a stranger overnight. I grabbed my keys. 15 minutes later, I was driving toward my grandfather's house. The estate meeting was scheduled there, at the old Lawson property. The same property Grandpa had owned for nearly 60 years. The same property I'd helped maintain for most of my adult life. The same property where my relatives suddenly seemed to think I wasn't welcome. The drive took 40 minutes. The entire way, I kept expecting someone to call, someone to explain, someone to tell me there had been a misunderstanding. Nobody called, nobody texted, nobody reached out. When I turned onto Lawson Road, my confusion finally became anger. Cars lined both sides of the driveway. My aunt's SUV, my uncle's truck, Melissa's sedan, my cousin Brian's luxury Mercedes. Everyone was there. Everyone except the person they apparently didn't want attending. Me. I parked near the gate, stepped out, and immediately noticed something unusual. The front entrance was locked, not unusual by itself, but Grandpa never locked the front gate during family gatherings. Never. In fact, he used to joke about it. Locks are for strangers. That was one of his favorite sayings. Apparently somebody had forgotten. Or maybe they remembered perfectly. As I approached, I noticed a printed sign attached to the gate. Private family meeting. No unauthorized entry. I actually laughed, because it was so ridiculous. Unauthorized? I had spent more time on that property during the last decade than most of the people inside combined. Yet somehow I was unauthorized. I pulled out my phone, called Melissa again. Voicemail. Called Brian. Voicemail. Called my aunt. Voicemail. Interesting. Very interesting. Because now it wasn't confusion anymore. Now it was coordinated. They weren't ignoring me individually. They were ignoring me together. That meant planning. And planning meant intention. I looked through the gate. Several relatives were standing on the front porch, talking, laughing, drinking coffee. One of them spotted me, then quickly looked away. A few seconds later, another noticed me. Then another. Soon everyone knew I was outside. Nobody came over. Nobody opened the gate. Nobody acknowledged me. They simply pretended I wasn't there. The exact same way they'd acted at Grandpa's funeral. And suddenly something clicked. This wasn't new. This had been building for years. I just hadn't wanted to see it. Growing up, my cousins were always treated differently. Their mistakes were forgiven. Mine were remembered. Their achievements were celebrated. Mine were expected. When Brian dropped out of college, everyone said he was finding himself. When I left college to launch a business, I was called irresponsible. When Melissa moved back home at 32, she was rebuilding. When I moved back temporarily after my divorce, I was failing. Different rules, same family. I just never realized how deep it went. Until now. A car door slammed behind me. I turned. A black sedan had just pulled into the driveway. Out stepped a man wearing a dark suit, briefcase, gray hair, serious expression. I recognized him immediately. Thomas Reed, my grandfather's attorney, the executor of the estate. Mr. Reed looked at me, then at the locked gate, then at the sign. His eyebrows slowly rose. "What exactly is this?" I laughed. "You tell me." He studied the situation for several seconds, then looked through the gate. Several relatives immediately stopped talking. The atmosphere changed instantly. Mr. Reed walked forward, pressed the intercom. A few moments later, my uncle appeared. His expression shifted when he saw the attorney. "Thomas. Gary." The attorney pointed toward me. "Why is Daniel standing outside?" My uncle hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. Then came the answer. The family felt it would be better if today's discussion remained private. The attorney blinked. Once. Twice. Then asked a question that made my uncle visibly uncomfortable. "Private from whom?" Silence. Nobody answered. Because everyone knew the answer sounded ridiculous. Private from the grandson who spent every weekend taking care of the deceased. Private from the person who handled half the medical appointments. Private from the family member Grandpa spoke to more than anyone else. The attorney's expression hardened. "I see." That was all he said. 3 simple words. But suddenly I felt something change. Because Thomas Reed wasn't just Grandpa's attorney. He'd known Grandpa for nearly 40 years. They played golf together, vacationed together, built businesses together. If anyone understood Grandpa's wishes, it was him. And judging by his face, he wasn't impressed. The gate buzzed, unlocked. My uncle reluctantly opened it. The attorney stepped inside, then stopped, turned around, and looked directly at me. "Daniel." "Yes? You coming?" The entire family on the porch froze. Every single one of them. Because suddenly their little plan had a problem. A very big problem. And it wasn't me. It was the man carrying the briefcase. The man holding Grandpa's final instructions. The man who looked completely unimpressed by what he'd just witnessed. I walked through the gate, past my stunned relatives, past Melissa, past Brian, past my aunt. None of them spoke. None of them smiled. And for the first time all morning, I realized something. They weren't worried about me attending. They were worried about what Grandpa might have left behind. And somehow, they already knew enough to be nervous. As we approached the front porch, Thomas Reed leaned slightly closer and lowered his voice, just enough for only me to hear. "Daniel." "What?" He glanced toward the house, then toward the briefcase in his hand, and quietly said, "Before today ends, a lot of people are going to wish they'd treated you differently." And at that exact moment, for the first time all morning, I became very interested in what was inside that briefcase. The moment we entered the house, every conversation stopped. Not slowed, not faded, stopped. The silence was immediate, heavy, uncomfortable. 23 people were gathered inside Grandpa's living room. Family members, spouses, adult grandchildren, a few longtime friends. Everyone sitting exactly where Grandpa used to host Thanksgiving dinners. Only today nobody was smiling, nobody was laughing, nobody was telling stories. Because today wasn't about remembering Grandpa. Today was about finding out who got what. And everybody knew it. Mr. Reed walked directly to the head of the table, the seat Grandpa always used. For a moment he stared at it, then placed his briefcase on the table. The metallic click of the locks echoed through the room. I noticed several relatives straighten in their chairs, almost instinctively, like students waiting for exam results. My Aunt Susan spoke first. "Can we begin?" Mr. Reed didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly removed several folders, a thick binder, and a sealed envelope. The envelope immediately caught my attention, because written across the front were 6 words: "Open in front of everyone." Grandpa's handwriting, unmistakable. The room noticed it too. Brian noticed. Melissa noticed. My uncle noticed. And suddenly everyone looked less confident. Much less. Mr. Reed sat down, folded his hands, and looked around the room. "Before we discuss the estate, there are a few things Henry Lawson specifically instructed me to address." Nobody looked happy about that, especially Brian. Because Brian wasn't interested in instructions. Brian was interested in numbers, properties, accounts, assets, money, always money. The attorney opened the binder, then began speaking. "For legal purposes, today's meeting is being recorded." Several heads turned. A few exchanged nervous glances. Interesting, very interesting, because honest people rarely fear records. Then came the next sentence. "And any individual found withholding estate-related information will be subject to immediate investigation." The room became noticeably quieter. My Uncle Gary shifted uncomfortably. Melissa looked down. Brian suddenly became fascinated with his coffee cup. And that's when I knew something. Something had happened. Something nobody wanted discussed. The attorney continued. "Now then." He opened the first folder. "Henry Lawson's estate consists of 4 primary categories." Everybody leaned forward. Properties, investments, savings, business interests, the exact categories everyone expected. Then came the first surprise. "The estate is significantly larger than previously estimated." The room froze. Several relatives exchanged looks. My aunt frowned. "What does that mean?" Mr. Reed glanced down, then calmly answered. "Current valuation exceeds $19 million. Nobody moved. Not one person. 19 million. Apparently everyone had underestimated Grandpa, including me. I knew he'd done well. I knew he'd invested wisely. But 19 million? That wasn't comfortable retirement money. That was wealth. Real wealth. Generational wealth. The room exploded. Questions came from every direction. How? Where? Since when? That's impossible. The attorney waited. Eventually the noise settled. Then he continued. The majority of the value comes from land acquisitions made between 1984 and 2003. My mind immediately went back to childhood. Grandpa buying farmland, vacant lots, small commercial properties. Everybody always teased him about it, called him old-fashioned, said he was wasting money. Apparently he wasn't, not even close. Then Mr. Reed opened another document, and the atmosphere shifted again. Because suddenly this wasn't about how much existed. It was about who would receive it. The attorney adjusted his glasses. The estate contains a number of specific directives. Nobody liked that wording. Specific directives meant conditions, and conditions meant uncertainty. Brian spoke first. What kind of directives? The attorney looked directly at him. The kind your grandfather considered important. Not exactly reassuring. Then Mr. Reed opened the sealed envelope. The room became silent. Again. Henry Lawson's handwriting covered 3 pages. The attorney began reading. If you're hearing this, then I've finally run out of opinions nobody asked for. A few nervous laughs appeared. Even I smiled. That sounded exactly like Grandpa. The statement continued. Over the last decade, I observed something fascinating. People became increasingly interested in my assets while becoming increasingly less interested in me. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody. The words hit too close. The attorney continued. I discovered who visited because they cared, and who visited because they calculated, who called because they missed me, and who called because they wanted information. The room grew colder. At least it felt that way. Because now everyone understood. Grandpa had been watching. The entire time. Then came the sentence that changed everything. For that reason, I made certain preparations before my death. Several relatives shifted nervously. The attorney continued reading. Some of those preparations concern a key. A key? The room exchanged confused looks. Even I frowned. A key? What key? Nobody seemed to know. Then Grandpa's letter continued. The key currently belongs to one person, the only person I trusted to keep it safe. Every eye in the room immediately started moving, searching, guessing, wondering. The attorney folded the page, then looked up, and for the first time all day, directly at me. My stomach tightened. No, surely not. Then Mr. Reed reached into his briefcase and removed something wrapped in cloth, something metallic, something old, very old. The room watched silently. The attorney carefully unwrapped it, and suddenly everyone saw it. A brass key, nearly 8 inches long, antique, heavy, unique, and somehow familiar. I recognized it immediately, because I'd seen it before, years ago, in Grandpa's workshop, hidden inside a locked wooden cabinet. The memory hit me instantly. I was 16. Grandpa had opened the cabinet, removed the key, looked at it for several seconds, then locked it away again. When I asked about it, he'd smiled and said, "One day, this key will solve a problem." At the time, I thought he was joking. Apparently, he wasn't. The attorney held up the key, then asked a question. "Does anyone here know what this opens?" Nobody answered. Nobody knew. Then he looked at me. "Daniel?" My heart began pounding, because suddenly, I remembered something. Not completely, just enough. A conversation from years earlier, a rainy afternoon, Grandpa repairing an old radio, and one strange sentence. "If anything ever happens to me, remember the train station." At the time, it made no sense. A train station? There hadn't been a train station in town for decades, but now, looking at that key, the memory returned, clearer than ever. The train station. The abandoned freight depot on the edge of town. A building Grandpa still owned. A building nobody cared about. A building everyone assumed was worthless. My eyes widened. The attorney noticed immediately, and so did everyone else. Mr. Reed slowly smiled. Not a happy smile. The smile of a man watching a puzzle finally come together. Then he said 8 words that instantly changed the room. "I believe Daniel knows where this goes." Quick question. Do you think Grandpa intentionally left Daniel this key because he trusted him the most? Or is there something bigger hidden behind it? Let us know your theory in the comments before we continue. And suddenly, every relative who had ignored me that morning was staring at me like I had just become the most important person in the house. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Nobody even looked away. Every eye in the room was locked on me. The same people who had ignored my calls. The same people who had locked me out of the gate. The same people who had pretended I wasn't family. Now suddenly wanted answers. Funny how quickly things change when money might be involved. Mr. Reed carefully placed the brass key on the table. "Daniel?" I swallowed. "I think I know." The room immediately became restless. Brian leaned forward. "Know what?" I ignored him. My attention was on the key, and on a memory that had been buried for years. A rainy afternoon. Grandpa's workshop. The smell of sawdust. Oil. Coffee. I had been 16. Grandpa was repairing an old radio. Out of nowhere, he'd said, "Most people only see value when someone else tells them where to look." At the time, I didn't understand. Then he'd pointed toward the old freight depot, the abandoned train station at the edge of town, and said, "That building has made me more money than anyone realizes." Back then, I assumed he was joking. Now, I wasn't so sure. Mr. Reed stood, closed the binder, then looked around the room. Henry instructed me to accompany Daniel to the location if he identified it correctly. The room erupted. What location? Where? What are we talking about? My aunt stood up. This is ridiculous. Mr. Reed calmly ignored her. Instead, he looked directly at me. Daniel. Yes? Where does the key belong? I took a breath, then answered. The old freight depot. Silence. Absolute silence. Several relatives exchanged confused looks. My cousin Melissa frowned. The abandoned train station? I nodded. Brian laughed. Actually laughed. That's impossible. Nobody joined him. Because despite his confidence, nobody knew. Not really. Mr. Reed slowly reached into his briefcase, then removed another envelope. A second envelope. This one sealed with red wax. He opened it, read a few lines, then nodded. Correct. The room froze. Brian's smile disappeared immediately. The attorney continued. Henry specifically instructed that if Daniel identified the correct location, all present beneficiaries would be invited to witness the opening. Witness. Interesting word. Not participate, not receive. Witness. That distinction wasn't lost on me. Within 20 minutes, a convoy of vehicles was moving across town. Everyone came. Nobody wanted to miss whatever was happening. The abandoned freight depot sat nearly 3 miles outside the city. Most people forgot it existed. A weathered brick structure surrounded by old rail lines and overgrown weeds. The place looked worthless, exactly the kind of property people overlook. Which suddenly made me think of Grandpa. Because Grandpa loved overlooked things. Old businesses, old land, old buildings, anything other people dismissed. As we pulled into the parking lot, Brian shook his head. We're seriously doing this? Nobody answered. The building stood exactly as I remembered. Massive wooden doors, faded paint, broken signs, decades of history. And yet something felt different. Because for the first time, I noticed security cameras, modern ones, recently installed. My stomach tightened. Someone had been maintaining this place. Recently. Very recently. Mr. Reed noticed too. Interesting. Very interesting. We approached the entrance. The giant doors remained locked. A thick iron mechanism secured the handles. And directly beneath it sat a keyhole. A very unusual keyhole. Large. Antique. Exactly the size of the brass key. The crowd became completely silent. Mr. Reed looked at me, then held out the key. Go ahead. My heart pounded. Not because I expected treasure, not because I expected money, because suddenly it felt like Grandpa was standing beside me, smiling, watching, waiting. I inserted the key. It fit perfectly. The mechanism clicked instantly. Several relatives gasped. Brian stopped smiling. Melissa looked nervous. My uncle looked confused. And suddenly I realized something. None of them had ever been here, not once, not in years. Yet Grandpa brought me here dozens of times. We'd walk around the property, talk about life, talk about business, talk about mistakes. At the time, I thought they were just walks. Now I wasn't so sure. The lock disengaged, the giant doors slowly opened, dust floated through the afternoon sunlight, the crowd stepped forward, and then everyone stopped. Because the building wasn't abandoned, not even close. Inside stood rows of restored equipment, climate-controlled storage, modern electrical systems, new lighting, renovated offices. The place looked incredible. The room exploded with confusion. What is this? When did this happen? Why didn't anyone know? Mr. Reed calmly walked inside, like he'd already seen everything, which, judging by his expression, he had. Then he pointed toward a large framed document mounted on the far wall. Perhaps that will help. Everyone gathered around, and immediately froze, because the document wasn't a permit, or a blueprint, or a license. It was a contract, a very expensive contract. My eyes moved to the number, then stopped. 7 figures, then 8, then 9. I blinked, looked again. Still there. The agreement was worth over $42 million. The crowd erupted. What? No way! That's impossible. My cousin nearly dropped her purse. Brian looked physically sick. And suddenly everything began making sense. The freight depot wasn't abandoned. It had been converted, leased, developed, profitable, extremely profitable. Grandpa had been collecting income from it for years, and apparently nobody knew. Nobody except. My eyes moved toward the signature line. My breath caught. Because there were only 2 names, Henry Lawson and mine, Daniel Lawson. The room went silent, dead silent. I stared at the page, confused, shocked, certain I was seeing things. My signature? No, not my signature. Something else. Then the realization hit. Years earlier, nearly 12 years earlier, Grandpa had asked me to witness several documents for a property transfer. I barely remembered it. At the time I was 21, fresh out of college, and apparently, without realizing it, I had become part of something much larger. Mr. Reed looked directly at the room, then spoke. Now we can discuss why Henry wanted everyone here. Nobody answered. Nobody could. Because suddenly, the estate meeting wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about a secret Grandpa had been hiding for over a decade. And judging by the expression on the attorney's face, the biggest revelation still hadn't been revealed. Then he reached into his briefcase, removed one final folder, and quietly said, "What you're about to hear is the real reason Henry knew someone would try to lock Daniel out." The entire building went silent. Because suddenly, everyone realized Grandpa had planned for this day long before he died. And somehow, he had seen everything coming. The building was completely silent. No whispers, no questions, no nervous laughter, just silence. 23 people standing inside an old freight depot that nobody had cared about for years. A building they had dismissed, ignored, forgotten. Exactly as Grandpa intended. Mr. Reed placed the final folder on a steel workbench near the center of the room. The sound echoed throughout the warehouse. Every head turned toward him. Every eye followed the folder. Because somehow everyone knew. This was it. The real reason we were here. The real reason Grandpa had left the key. The real reason certain relatives had tried so hard to keep me away from the estate meeting. Mr. Reed slowly opened the folder. Inside were photographs, letters, financial records, and something else. A small digital recorder. The moment he placed it on the table, several faces changed, especially Brian's. I noticed immediately. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightened, his confidence disappeared. Interesting. Very interesting. Mr. Reed picked up the recorder, then looked around the room. 3 years ago, Henry Lawson became concerned. Nobody spoke. He became concerned that certain family members were more interested in controlling his assets than protecting his interests. The room froze. My aunt crossed her arms. My uncle looked away. Melissa stared at the floor. Brian remained completely motionless. Mr. Reed continued. As a result, Henry began documenting important conversations. My stomach dropped. Documenting? The attorney pressed a button. The recorder crackled. Then a familiar voice filled the building. Grandpa. Older, tired, but unmistakably Grandpa. The entire room became still. Then another voice appeared. Brian's voice. The recording was clear, painfully clear. Honestly, Grandpa, you're not getting younger. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The conversation continued. Brian laughed, then said something that made the room visibly uncomfortable. At some point, somebody responsible is going to have to manage everything. Grandpa asked a simple question. And who do you think that should be? Brian answered immediately. Me. Several relatives exchanged glances. The recording continued. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Daniel doesn't understand business like I do. My stomach tightened. Brian looked physically ill. The recording continued. He spends too much time helping people. The irony hit everyone at once, because suddenly Brian wasn't insulting me. He was exposing himself. The recording ended. Silence. Absolute silence. Then Mr. Reed played another. This one was worse. Much worse. A meeting. Private. Several years old. Multiple voices. And suddenly my uncle's voice appeared. Then my aunt's. Then Brian's again. Talking. Planning. Speculating. Not about Grandpa. Not about his health. Not about helping him. About inheritance. Property. Assets. Control. The room became colder with every second. Then came the worst moment. A sentence nobody could take back. Brian laughed and said, "Once the old man is gone, everything gets easier." The recording ended. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Brian looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him. My aunt covered her mouth. My uncle stared at the concrete floor. And suddenly I understood. This wasn't why Grandpa made the recordings. The recordings weren't revenge. They were confirmation. Confirmation that his instincts had been right. Mr. Reed turned off the recorder, then opened another document. This is Henry's final statement regarding the succession plan. Everyone listened. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. The attorney began reading. For years I wondered whether people valued family or merely valued access to family assets. Eventually they answered the question themselves. The words echoed through the warehouse. I built this family believing character mattered. Some proved me right. Some proved me wrong. Then came the sentence that made my chest tighten. The person I trust most is not the person who wanted the estate. It is the person who never asked for it. I swallowed hard. The attorney continued. Daniel never requested ownership, never requested special treatment, never requested rewards. He simply showed up. Again, and again, and again. The room was silent, because everyone knew it was true. Then Mr. Reed turned another page and revealed the final secret, the actual purpose of the key. Not the building, not the contract, not the business, the key itself. The attorney smiled slightly, a rare smile, then explained. The depot was never the inheritance. Everyone looked confused, including me. Mr. Reed continued. The key was a test. A test? Nobody understood. Then he explained. Henry knew someone would try to exclude Daniel. He predicted it years ago. He believed that if certain relatives thought Daniel was no longer important, they would reveal exactly who they were. The realization hit me immediately. The locked gate, the ignored phone calls, the fake family-only message, the attempts to keep me away. Grandpa had predicted all of it, years in advance. The attorney nodded. As soon as Daniel was excluded, the test was complete. The warehouse became completely silent, because suddenly everyone understood. Grandpa had never needed the key to open the depot. He needed the key to reveal people. The key wasn't unlocking a building, it was unlocking truth. Then came the final surprise, the very last one. Mr. Reed removed a sealed envelope. The final envelope, written in Grandpa's handwriting, for everyone. The attorney opened it, then read aloud. If you're hearing this, then the test is over. Some of you passed, some of you failed, but all of you revealed yourselves. Nobody moved. The words hit harder than any inheritance announcement ever could. Then came Grandpa's final message. Families are not measured by who appears when money is available. Families are measured by who appears when nothing is available. Remember that. Because one day, people will treat you exactly the way you treated others. The warehouse remained silent. Then the attorney folded the letter and looked up. That concludes Henry Lawson's final instructions. Nobody argued. Nobody complained. Nobody challenged anything. Because there was nothing left to challenge. The truth had already won. One by one, relatives began leaving, quietly, without arguments, without excuses, without eye contact. The same people who had arrived expecting an inheritance battle, now leaving with something much heavier: regret. Within 30 minutes, only 3 people remained: Mr. Reed, me, and Grandpa's empty chair near the office window. The attorney packed his briefcase, then handed me the brass key. I looked down at it. Heavy, cold, worn by time. "Keep it." I nodded. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Mr. Reed smiled. "You know what Henry's favorite thing about you was?" I looked up. "What?" The attorney laughed softly. "He said you were the only person who never treated him like an estate." My throat tightened, because that sounded exactly like Grandpa. Outside, the evening sun was setting. Golden light poured through the warehouse windows. For a moment, it almost felt like he was there, watching, smiling, satisfied. And suddenly I realized something. The greatest thing Grandpa left behind wasn't money, wasn't property, wasn't ownership. It was clarity, the kind that only arrives when people reveal who they really are. I slipped the brass key into my pocket, took one last look around the depot, then headed toward the door, toward the future, toward the responsibility Grandpa had trusted me with. And as I stepped outside, I couldn't help smiling, because in the end, the only thing Grandpa truly wanted protected wasn't his wealth. It was the lesson. And unlike the estate, that was something nobody could ever steal. What do you think? Was Grandpa right to trust Daniel over the rest of the family? And if you were in Daniel's position, would you forgive your relatives or cut them off for good? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoy family betrayal, inheritance battles, and emotional revenge stories, subscribe for more.